Marriage is not about love. It is about duty, Edward Whitmore had said, his voice cold and precise, leaving a silence in the grand library that felt heavier than the oak-paneled walls themselves. Amelia Hawthorne sat at the corner desk, hands folded neatly atop a stack of papers she had no intention of reading again, her gaze tracing the flickering shadows cast by the tall candelabra that lined the room. The rain outside hammered against the windows, drumming a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of her quiet resignation. She had once tried, with careful steps and gentle words, to bridge the chasm that separated them, to find even the smallest trace of warmth in the Duke's steel-gray eyes. But each effort had been met with polite indifference, a measured nod, or worse, a glance that made her feel as if her very presence were a disruption to his meticulously ordered life. The memory of her hopeful attempts flickered like the candlelight, a fleeting glow swallowed quickly by shadow. Tonight, she would not try again. She would fulfill her duties, attend to the estate, oversee the evening's preparations, and retreat quietly to her chambers, leaving Edward to his solitude. Yet even in her withdrawal, a subtle tension hung in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been lost, or perhaps what had never been. She could feel it when he passed her by without a word, when his hand lingered just slightly longer than necessary on the back of a chair, when his brow furrowed as though some distant thought, unspoken and unresolved, had taken root. The library smelled of aged wood and polished brass, the scent mingling with the faint aroma of rain seeping through the stone walls, and Amelia found herself breathing it in as though it could fortify her against the cold indifference of her husband. Outside, the wind howled through the mansion's high turrets, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant pine, a reminder that the world beyond these walls continued to move, indifferent to their frozen standoff. She heard the faint shuffle of Edward's steps as he walked along the upper gallery, each footfall measured, deliberate, and yet betraying the slightest hesitation. Amelia's heart did not race. It had learned to move slowly, to measure itself in quiet patience, in the small victories of maintaining composure, in the subtle reclamation of her own dignity. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, smoothed the folds of her gown, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. For tonight, she would watch, she would wait, and she would continue to exist in the space between duty and desire, fully aware that even a heart encased in ice might one day recognize what it had been missing. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each chime marking the passage of time. Yet within that room, time seemed suspended, heavy with expectation and the unspoken promise that this silent endurance could, in some far-reaching moment, awaken a realization too late, a truth that Edward Whitmore might only grasp when faced with the prospect of losing the quiet, steadfast presence of Amelia Hawthorne forever. The next morning, the gray light of dawn seeped through the tall, arched windows of Whitmore Manor, casting elongated shadows across the polished oak floors. Amelia Hawthorne moved silently along the corridor, her footsteps barely audible over the distant calls of the estate staff preparing for the day. The air carried a crisp chill, the remnants of last night's rain still clinging to the ivy-covered stone walls outside. She paused at the landing overlooking the grand hall, watching as sunlight struck the crystal chandelier, scattering tiny prisms of light across the marble beneath. Edward Whitmore appeared in the hall below, adjusting the cuffs of his dark suit with a meticulous hand, his expression unreadable, yet something about the tilt of his shoulders betrayed a tension Amelia had not noticed before. He was speaking to the steward, his voice low, measured, and yet each syllable seemed weighted with consideration beyond the usual concern for estate matters. Amelia felt a flicker of curiosity, a quiet reminder that beneath his composed exterior, Edward's mind was rarely at rest. She continued to her own chamber, her movements fluid, practiced, yet each turn of her wrist, each soft footfall, seemed amplified in the stillness of the morning. The scent of polished wood, waxed floors, and morning dew from the gardens below mingled to create an atmosphere that was at once grounding and unsettling. Edward's steps echoed faintly from the hall as he moved closer, and Amelia could feel the subtle shift in the energy between them, an invisible thread drawing taut with unspoken expectation. She prepared tea in silence, measuring each scoop of leaves with deliberate care, listening to the distant sounds of the staff, the soft clink of silverware, the rustle of fabric as housemaids attended to their duties. When Edward entered the sitting room, the faintest pause in his stride caught Amelia's attention. The way he observed the light catching the edges of the room, the patterns of shadow across the walls, the way his eyes lingered for the briefest moment longer than necessary. He spoke then, his voice smooth, calm, yet imbued with a subtle weight that suggested thoughtfulness rather than indifference, asking about the plans for the day, inquiring not only after the estate, but after her opinions, her insights, the way she had arranged the household. Amelia responded carefully, her tone composed, each word measured, yet beneath the surface, a spark of something unacknowledged stirred, a recognition that perhaps, finally, Edward was seeing her efforts, not as mere dutiful actions, but as a reflection of her own quiet strength. The conversation flowed with a delicate tension, pauses that spoke volumes, gestures that hinted at acknowledgement, fleeting smiles, the brushing of hands over parchment, the subtle crossing of glances that neither would fully articulate. Outside, the morning continued, the gardens shimmering with wet leaves, the sound of birds cautious yet persistent, a distant carriage announcing arrivals at the estate. Yet within the walls of Whitmore Manor, time seemed suspended, measured not in minutes but in moments of awareness, a slow unfolding in which both Edward and Amelia began to navigate the fragile terrain of attention, care, and perhaps the initial stirrings of a recognition too long delayed, the quiet tension building toward a reckoning neither dared to speak aloud. By noon, Whitmore Manor had begun to change its face for the evening reception, though the house itself seemed reluctant to welcome warmth. Servants moved through the corridors with trays of polished silver, fresh linens, and arrangements of white roses clipped from the greenhouse, their pale petals opening beneath the glow of newly lit lamps. Amelia stood in the dining hall with a ledger tucked against her waist, giving quiet instructions with the calm assurance of a woman who had learned to keep an entire household breathing even when her own heart felt neglected. Every chair was placed at an exact distance from the table. Every candle was trimmed. Every crystal glass shone without a single clouded mark. She had overseen it all, not to win Edward Whitmore's approval, not anymore, but because dignity was the one inheritance no one could take from her. Across the hall, Edward watched from beneath the shadow of the archway, his gloved hand resting against the carved stone, his expression still as winter. He had hosted governors, senators, judges, and men whose fortunes could move whole counties, yet he had never noticed how much of his house depended on the quiet precision of his wife. The realization unsettled him. It moved through him like cold water beneath thin ice. Amelia turned slightly, sensing his presence before she saw him, and for one suspended second their eyes met across the length of the hall. She did not smile. She did not lower her gaze. She simply waited, composed and distant, and that distance struck Edward more sharply than any accusation could have done. Before he could speak, Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, approached with concern pressed into every line of her face. The musicians had been delayed by muddy roads 5 miles south of the estate, and Lady Margaret Whitmore, Edward's sharp-tongued aunt, had arrived an hour early with 3 unexpected guests and a talent for finding fault before removing her gloves. Amelia listened without flinching. She adjusted the schedule, sent for the piano in the west parlor, ordered warm cider for the arriving guests, and redirected the footmen with such grace that the disruption vanished before it had time to become scandal. Edward remained where he stood, witnessing a command that did not need volume to be obeyed. Later, when the first carriages rolled beneath the covered entrance and the reception began, Amelia moved through the rooms like candlelight over dark water, soft but impossible to ignore. She greeted each guest by name, remembered an elderly judge's preference for black tea, asked after a young widow's son at school in Boston, and soothed Lady Margaret's criticism with a single gracious remark that left the older woman momentarily speechless. Edward should have felt relief. Instead, he felt exposed. For years he had told himself that Amelia had accepted the shape of their marriage, that her silence meant contentment, that her patience required no tenderness from him. Yet tonight, as he saw how others warmed beneath her attention, how their faces opened when she spoke, he understood that she had not been empty. She had been giving light to everyone except the man who had kept her in shadow. Near the end of the evening, a senator's wife touched Amelia's arm and said, with honest admiration, that Whitmore Manor had never felt more alive. Amelia thanked her gently, but Edward saw the flicker in her eyes, the brief pain of being praised for bringing warmth to a home where she had slept cold for years. He stepped toward her then, compelled by something he could not name. Amelia turned before he reached her. A servant had entered with a sealed letter on a silver tray. The envelope bore the mark of Hawthorne House, her childhood home. Her fingers paused over it. Edward noticed. So did Lady Margaret. The music from the parlor softened to a distant murmur as Amelia broke the seal, read the first line, and grew very still. Whatever the letter contained, it took the color from her face, but not the strength from her posture. She folded it carefully, as though calm could be made from paper and discipline. Edward moved closer, his voice lower than the room around them. Amelia, what is it? She looked at him then, not as a wife seeking comfort, but as a woman measuring whether comfort still belonged to her. My mother is ill, she said quietly. I must leave for Virginia in the morning. Edward Whitmore remained near the window, the pale glow of the afternoon sun tracing the sharp lines of his face as he observed Amelia preparing for her journey. The scent of wet earth from the gardens below mixed with the faint perfume of roses she had arranged in the drawing room, a subtle signature of her presence that seemed to linger even as she moved through the halls. Amelia packed carefully, folding her gowns with precision, placing letters in their envelopes, and ensuring that every trunk was balanced for travel. She paused briefly at the mirror in her chamber, her reflection steady, composed, yet the faint shadow of hesitation crossed her features. Edward stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, the sound echoing softly in the quiet morning. He did not speak immediately, instead allowing the silence to stretch, the tension between them as palpable as the chills seeping from the open window. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a calm defiance, a wordless statement that she had resolved her place in the world independent of his attention. Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands clasped behind his back, the gesture one of both restraint and consideration. He approached, his voice low and steady, yet threaded with something he had not intended to reveal, asking gently if she needed assistance with her preparations, if the carriage would require anything extra, if her travel would be comfortable. Amelia inclined her head, acknowledging the inquiry without revealing the undercurrent of surprise that stirred within her, a subtle recognition that Edward's tone carried more than duty. They moved together through the hall, the light falling in soft angles across the polished wood and the cream-colored rugs, Edward slightly behind yet attentive to the direction of her steps, the placement of her trunks, the organization of the smaller parcels. He noted the care with which she had organized each item, the thoughtfulness that extended beyond mere logistics into an unspoken care for the well-being of those around her. Amelia sensed his gaze, yet did not yield to it, maintaining the quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of navigating the emotional distance between them. Outside, the carriage waited beneath the covered portico, the polished wood gleaming despite the mist and the lingering droplets from the morning's rain. Amelia adjusted her gloves, secured her hat, and stepped toward the carriage, Edward following a pace behind, careful not to crowd, yet unwilling to allow the distance between them to remain. A final check of documents, a glance at the folded map, a moment to take in the estate one last time before the road took her south. Edward spoke softly, suggesting minor adjustments to her route, the tone practical, yet laced with a concern he could not fully mask. Amelia listened, responding with calm efficiency, yet there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes, the recognition of his attention, the awareness that he had noticed her preparation, her diligence, her steadiness. As the carriage door closed, Edward extended a hand, not as a command, not as a duty, but as an offer of partnership, a subtle gesture that carried a weight far greater than protocol or expectation. Amelia took it, their fingers brushing briefly, a simple contact that resonated more deeply than any conversation could. The horses moved forward, the wheels of the carriage turning on the wet gravel, the sound soft against the murmurs of the estate. Edward remained at the portico, watching the carriage disappear down the lane. the rising sun casting a golden glow across his features, and for the first time that day, a thought settled fully in his mind, a quiet understanding of what he might have overlooked, the depth of Amelia Hawthorne's presence in his life, and the realization that even in her composure, she had left an impression that would not easily fade. The journey south was long and quiet, the carriage gliding over the damp gravel roads with a steady rhythm that matched Amelia Hawthorne's deliberate breathing. The countryside stretched in muted greens and browns, mist clinging to the low hills, while the early autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Amelia held the letter from her mother in her lap, reading it once more before. Tucking it carefully into the folds of her travel cloak, her thoughts weighing heavily on the words within. Edward Whitmore had insisted on accompanying her part of the way, citing concern for her safety, though he never once revealed the deeper motivation behind his vigilance. He rode beside the carriage in silence, his tall frame erect, eyes fixed ahead, yet occasionally flicking to observe her expression, the subtle movements of her hands, the set of her jaw. The wind stirred the edges of the carriage curtains, brushing against Amelia's cheeks and carrying with it the faint aroma of horses and wet leaves, a sensory reminder of the distance between her and the familiar halls of Whitmore Manor. She sensed his presence without turning, aware of the unspoken tension that filled the space like a tangible force, a bridge of awareness that neither dared to cross with words alone. Edward's mind traced the events of the morning repeatedly, considering each gesture, each glance, the disciplined care with which Amelia had organized every detail of her departure, and in that reflection, a stirring of something long dormant began to take shape, a recognition of the quiet strength and unwavering composure that had defined her existence within the walls of his estate. The carriage dipped into a shallow valley, the sound of water from a nearby stream accompanying the soft clop of hooves, and Amelia allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, her gaze drifting across the passing scenery, the mist rising in thin, silvery wisps. Edward shifted slightly, lowering his eyes to observe her profile, the soft light illuminating the determined set of her features, and he felt an unfamiliar tug of urgency, a silent plea that the distance between them might not remain unbridgeable. The hours passed with measured precision, the carriage halting only briefly for horses to rest and water, and with each stop, Edward's attention to detail, to Amelia's comfort, deepened the weight of his reflection, as though he had only now begun to measure the extent of her steadfast presence in his life. The sun began its slow descent, casting a warm golden hue over the undulating hills, and Amelia noted the changing light with the practiced eye of one who observed her world with meticulous care. Edward adjusted the reins of his horse with a subtle tension, his jaw tightening imperceptibly, his mind wrestling with the thought that the moments he had once dismissed, the quiet endurance of his wife, held more significance than he had ever acknowledged. As the carriage approached the inn that would serve as their stop for the night, the sound of the village greeting their arrival carried over the crisp air, and Amelia prepared herself to disembark, carefully lifting each trunk with steady hands, placing them on the stone path with exacting care. Edward descended beside her, offering a hand to steady the smallest trunk, and in that brief touch, neither commanding nor expected, a silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the shared awareness that the journey, though outwardly physical, had also become an inward reckoning for Edward Whitmore, a quiet recognition that the woman beside him, Amelia Hawthorne, had been shaping the course of his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. By the time dusk settled over the small Virginia town, the inn had drawn its curtains against the gathering cold, and warm lamplight pooled across the narrow hallways like honey over dark wood. Amelia Hawthorne stood in the modest parlor beside the front window, watching the last color drain from the sky beyond the glass. The road outside glistened from an earlier rain, and each passing carriage wheel left a soft whisper on the wet street. She should have felt relief at being closer to her mother. Only one more day's journey from Hawthorne House, yet the quiet of the room pressed against her with unexpected force. Edward Whitmore remained near the fireplace, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, his face half lit by the flames and half hidden in shadow. He had spoken little since their arrival, but his silence no longer felt like dismissal. It felt burdened. It felt aware. Amelia removed her gloves slowly, finger by finger, and laid them beside the folded letter on the small table. Edward saw the gesture, saw the care in it, and felt again the strange ache that had followed him all day. She had always moved this way, he realized, with patience, with discipline, with a grace that asked for nothing and therefore revealed too much. A younger maid entered with tea and bread, apologizing softly because the kitchen had little else prepared at such a late hour. Amelia thanked her with such gentleness that the girl's anxious expression eased at once. Edward watched the exchange, remembering the senator's wife, the footman at Whitmore Manor, Mrs. Bell's relief whenever Amelia entered a room. People steadied around her. He had steadied around her too, though he had been too proud to notice. When the maid left, Amelia poured tea for them both without asking, not from affection, perhaps not anymore, but from habit shaped by years of care. Edward accepted the cup, his fingers brushing the porcelain saucer, and the words rose in him before he could bury them. "You should have told me your mother had been declining." Amelia looked at him across the thin veil of steam. "I did." The answer was quiet. It did not accuse. That made it worse. Edward's hand tightened around the cup. "When?" "3 months ago," she said. "In the breakfast room. You were reading a letter from Albany. You said the estate accounts required your full attention." The fire shifted, sending sparks of light across the wall. Edward remembered the morning only vaguely, a pale dress, a voice across the table, his own impatience disguised as responsibility. Duty had been his shield for so long that he had mistaken it for virtue. Amelia turned back toward the window. "After that, I stopped mentioning things that mattered." A carriage passed outside, its lantern sliding briefly across her face. Edward saw no anger there, only a kind of tired clarity that frightened him more than tears would have done. He set the cup down with deliberate care. "Amelia, I did not understand." "No," she replied, still gentle, still distant. "You did not try to understand." The room seemed to grow smaller around them. For years, Edward had ruled courtrooms, estates, and conversations with the practiced calm of a man certain of his own command, yet before his wife's quiet truth, he found no defense that did not sound hollow. He looked at her hands, folded now against the dark fabric of her traveling dress, and remembered how many times those same hands had placed flowers in his study, mended the fraying peace of his household, written letters he had signed without reading, offered warmth he had called obligation. The realization did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like winter water under a locked door, slow, cold, unstoppable. Amelia lifted the letter once more and held it close. "I will continue to Hawthorne House at first light," she said. "You need not come farther." Edward looked at her then, and for the first time, the thought of returning alone to Whitmore Manor felt not peaceful, not orderly, but unbearably empty. Edward Whitmore rose before the first light of dawn, the unquiet except for the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional sigh of wind through the eaves. He dressed quickly, his fingers brushing the polished leather of his boots, the dark fabric of his coat pressed smooth against his shoulders as though each crease might steady the tumult within him. The memory of Amelia Hawthorne's steady composure, the quiet dignity that had marked every movement from Whitmore Manor to this inn, weighed upon him with an intensity that made each step feel measured, deliberate, a silent accounting of time lost. Outside, the morning mist clung to the roads, the soft glow of rising sun turning the wet leaves into tiny pools of gold. He adjusted the reins of his horse, the animal shifting beneath him, sensing his restlessness. Edward's mind traced every detail from the previous day, the way Amelia had folded her gloves, the precise order in which she had packed her trunk, the faint flicker in her eyes when she acknowledged the letter from her mother. It was not the letter itself that had struck him, but the way she bore it, the calm strength with which she met her own burdens without asking for aid, without expecting attention. He had been blind to it for too long. He set off down the road, the cold air sharp against his face, every clop of the horse's hooves against the damp gravel echoing with purpose. Each passing mile carried him farther from the inn, and closer to Amelia, yet he moved cautiously, aware that distance had built a silent wall between them that could not be breached with haste alone. His thoughts returned to her words, gentle but firm, that he had not tried to understand her. The truth of those words cut deeper than any dispute, any raised voice could have done. He must show her now, through action rather than argument, that he had begun to see, that he understood, that he recognized her worth beyond duty and etiquette. The horizon shifted with the sun climbing higher, casting long rays across the fields and low hills that separated them from her family home. Edward's grip on the reins tightened, his mind plotting the fastest route, considering every path, every detour, mindful of the roads that would keep him close but unthreatening, a presence rather than an imposition. The faint scent of pine from the surrounding forests mingled with the damp air, a reminder of the quiet mornings he had shared at Whitmore Manor, the breakfasts Amelia had arranged, the careful measurements of tea and toast, gestures he had failed to note until now. He urged his horse forward, faster now, the urgency tempered with careful thought, the memory of her calm determination guiding him as much as the road ahead. Thoughts of the letters, the trunks, the orderly preparations weighed on him, and he realized that she had been preparing not only for her journey, but for the moment he might finally comprehend her steadfastness. The rising sun touched the distant rooftops, and Edward's eyes, steel gray and unyielding yet softened by dawning understanding, focused ahead on the solitary figure of Amelia Hawthorne as she moved steadily along the road, her posture dignified, her stride measured, her presence both unassuming and undeniable. In that instant, the long hours of indifference, the quiet neglect, and the missed acknowledgments crystallized into a singular truth. He could no longer remain distant, could no longer hide behind duty or pride, and he spurred his horse with purpose, each stride carrying him toward a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. Edward Whitmore reached the crest of the small hill overlooking the winding road where Amelia Hawthorne walked steadily toward her mother's estate, the morning light catching the soft folds of her cloak and illuminating the careful rhythm of her steps. Each stride carried her forward with purpose, yet unaware of the presence steadily gaining on her, a presence shaped by urgency and the long weight of realization. The horse beneath Edward moved with controlled speed, its hooves striking the gravel in a steady cadence, echoing like a heartbeat alongside his own rising anticipation. He could see the slight lift of her chin, the measured set of her shoulders, and he understood in a way he had never before that every detail, every careful movement, spoke of a woman who had borne years of quiet endurance without complaint, without expectation, a strength that demanded recognition. The countryside stretched in muted golds and browns, the dew-laden fields glistening beneath the sun, and Edward's eyes traced the familiar lines of the road she had followed as a child, the narrow wooden bridge, the bend where the stream caught the light just so, and he thought of all the moments he had failed to notice her, the subtle gestures he had mistaken for duty or routine. The distance between them closed steadily, yet each step of his horse seemed to bring with it a new clarity, a sharpening of awareness that his indifference had been a quiet cruelty, a missed opportunity to acknowledge the life that had unfolded quietly beside him. Amelia paused briefly to adjust a strap on her trunk, her hands nimble, precise, and Edward felt a pang of urgency tighten in his chest, a silent demand that he make his presence known not as authority, but as recognition, as the acknowledgement of every act of steadfast care she had offered without request. He slowed his horse as he approached, careful not to startle her, and spoke then, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of his realization. "Amelia, wait." She turned, the faintest lift of an eyebrow, the controlled tilt of her lips betraying neither impatience nor surprise, only measured attention. Edward dismounted swiftly yet quietly, closing the distance between them with steps that matched her pace, until he stood mere feet away, the sunlight falling across his face and her own, illuminating the subtle warmth of color that had never been a distraction but a truth unacknowledged. He extended a hand, not commanding, not pleading, but offering the recognition he had long denied, the acknowledgement of every quiet endurance, every graceful act of care, every unspoken patience that had gone unnoticed. Amelia looked at his hand, then into his eyes, and the faintest hint of surprise flickered across her expression, mingling with a calm that had long been her shield. Edward spoke again, gently, almost a whisper against the morning air. "I see you now, Amelia, in every way I should have, in every way I failed to before." She did not move immediately, did not reach for his hand, yet the quiet acceptance in her eyes, the controlled exhale, suggested that she had heard him, that she recognized the sincerity without needing grand gestures. The road stretched behind her. The fields rolled softly to the horizon, and Edward realized that the journey they had shared, the silent reckonings, the long hours of observation and quiet attention, had led to this precise moment where acknowledgement could finally meet endurance, and the morning held a suspended breath as they stood together, separated by only a few steps, yet connected in a recognition that neither had fully allowed themselves to feel until now. Amelia Hawthorne looked at Edward Whitmore's outstretched hand as the morning wind moved softly through the fields between them, carrying the scent of wet grass, fallen leaves, and wood smoke from the distant chimneys of Hawthorne House. For a long moment, she did not answer. She only stood on the narrow Virginia road with her traveling cloak drawn close, her face calm beneath the pale gold light, while Edward waited before her with a humility that seemed unfamiliar even to himself. He had been a man shaped by inheritance, by title, by the rigid ceremonies of power, yet none of those things could help him now. Not here. Not before the wife he had mistaken for a fixture in his life, instead of the quiet force that had held it together. Amelia lowered her gaze to his hand, then back to his face. "I believe you see me today," she said softly. "But seeing is not the same as staying awake." The words entered him with a stillness sharper than reproach. Edward let his hand fall, not in defeat, but in acceptance. "You are right," he said. "I do not ask you to forget what I failed to give. I only ask for the chance to become a man who does not require loss before he learns gratitude." Amelia's expression changed then, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with the faintest easing of the guard she had worn for so long. Behind them, the carriage driver waited beside the trunk, pretending not to listen as the horses stirred in their harnesses. Ahead, Hawthorne House stood beyond a line of old maple trees, its white columns weathered by years of sun and rain, its windows bright with the frail hope of home. Amelia turned toward it, and Edward followed her gaze. "My mother needs me," she said. "Then I will not take you from her," he replied. "I will come only as far as you permit, and I will leave the moment my presence becomes a burden." That answer seemed to weigh upon her more than any pleading could have done, because it offered what he had so rarely given her before: choice. They walked the remaining half-mile in quiet companionship, Edward keeping a respectful pace beside her, close enough to help if the road dipped, distant enough to prove that his concern had learned restraint. At the gate, an older servant hurried out with tears of relief, and Amelia moved forward at once, her composure breaking only into tenderness as she entered the house of her childhood. Edward remained in the hall, hat in hand, surrounded by faded wallpaper, polished floors, and the smell of lavender medicine and old books. For 3 days, he stayed nearby, but never intruded. He sent for a better physician from Richmond, arranged firewood when the nights turned cold, and wrote every necessary letter himself rather than placing the burden upon Amelia. He did not announce his efforts. He did not ask whether she had noticed. But she did. She noticed him standing quietly outside her mother's room with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in his hand. She noticed the new softness in his voice when he spoke to the servants. She noticed the way he looked away whenever gratitude might have made the moment about him. On the 4th evening, as sunset filled the parlor with amber light, Amelia found him by the window, reading one of her mother's old garden books. "My mother asked whether you intend to remain for supper," she said. Edward closed the book carefully. "Do you wish me to remain?" Amelia looked toward the window, where the first evening star trembled above the darkening trees. "I wish you to understand that I cannot go back to being invisible." He stepped closer, stopping before the distance became presumption. "Then I will spend the rest of my life proving that you are not." The silence that followed was not cold. It was fragile, breathing, alive. Amelia extended her hand, and this time Edward did not seize it. He received it as though it were something entrusted to him, something sacred in its quietness. Outside, the Virginia dusk settled over the fields, and within that fading light, the Duke who had once called love unnecessary learned that a heart does not return because it is commanded. It returns when it is finally honored. Some hearts only learn to beat again when held with patience, humility, and the courage to see what duty alone could never save.